When we first started making films about animal issues, it was rather unconscious, and we didn't have a historical perspective on what we were doing. The American author Harriet Beecher Stowe came into our awareness, and it's a very powerful experience to be working for a cause, trying to solve very difficult problems of education and transformation, and to learn of someone in the 1850s, pick up her writings and feel this personal connection, feel this confidence that if Harriet Beecher Stowe were alive today, she would understand exactly what all of us are doing and why. The book that she's most well known for is called Uncle Tom's Cabin. Published in 1852, 300,000 copies were sold in the first year in the US, 1.5 million copies were sold in Europe, and it had an electrifying effect on the discussion and the debate around the slavery issue in the United States. It was a revolutionary book, I think, for any era, but in that era, the degree of impact it had, the pervasiveness at all levels of society was unprecedented. Nothing like it had ever really happened. Reading her work and her own writings about it helped us understand this idea that half of the problem is this terrible misunderstanding of who the injustice is happening to, and it always has been. If you go back to the time before women had the vote and were barred from all these professions, and you look at the ideas people had about who women are, those ideas validated the status that women had and made it sound like it was all meant to be. And so it always is. And so we came to see this about our own issue that we're working on with animals, that the ideas that are widely held about who these animals are make what happens to them and their status and the way they're treated in a way seem perfectly logical, meant to be. So she helped us get clear about this, that this is one of the tasks in front of us, to show who the animals are and challenge some of these ideas, these stereotypes. So if we think about the world that she lived in, and you think about how vast areas of our country were caught up in human slavery, millions and millions of people. I think it was 1 in 7 people living on this continent were enslaved, bought, sold, living and dying under the absolute arbitrary control of others. There was nothing barred really, no limits. The degree to which it was tied into every aspect of the society was almost unimaginable. And one of the most remarkable things about this, when you study it, is that highly educated people, people that otherwise could be considered of benign intent, people who were extraordinarily religious, were okay with this practice and thought it was a godly institution. And there was this other dimension of it, that to the degree that people saw the problem and were disturbed by it, the great majority of them felt like what was needed was an improvement in the way slavery was carried out. So Christian slavery was much more talked about than abolition of slavery, much more. Many more people were focused on that, to the extent anyone was focused on it. And the people who thought slavery needed to go were very much marginalized for most of the time slavery existed, right up to the end. In order to get a feel for this, one of the things that I tried to do was read a little bit about some of the writings of the day and try to understand how this existed in the minds of people who were educated. And I would like to just read a few excerpts of a quote by a notable American, and at the end I'll tell you, maybe someone knows who this notable American is. This language and these ideas are offensive and painful to read, and that's why I'm reading them. A black, after hard labor through the day, will be induced by the slightest amusements to sit up till midnight or later, the knowing he must be out at the first dawn of the morning. They are at least as brave and more adventuresome, but this may perhaps proceed from a want of forethought which prevents their seeing danger till it be present. They are more ardent after their female, but love seems with them to be more an eager desire than a tender, delicate mixture of sentiment and sensation. Their griefs are transient. In general, their existence appears to participate more of sensation than reflection. This is a highly educated person, and he's saying some have been educated. But I could never find a black that uttered a thought above the level of plain narration, never seen even an elementary trait of painting or sculpture. And then, there's the stereotypical idea that, these people can carry a tune, but could they ever compose music? Who knows? Probably not. And of course, no poetry. There's no poetry amongst them. And so it was a very elaborate belief system. And it's remarkable how incredibly off the mark this belief system is. But then the author is Thomas Jefferson. The reason that I think it's really important to think about this is that here is one of the better people of the era who did a lot of positive things, had a lot of opportunities, incredibly gifted, and this is what he came up with. Imagine what people who didn't have so many advantages and were not as positive as a person. And I would like to just read a few excerpts of Harriet Beecher Stowe's autobiography, what it was like for her and other people who saw how incredibly inaccurate this understanding was of these millions of people living amongst the whole country. Nobody can tell 1,000 ways by trade, by family affinity, or political expediency. The free part of our country is constantly tempted to complicity with the slaveholding part. There are clergymen who would not on any account so far commit themselves as to preach on the evils of slavery or pray for the slaves in their pulpits. The situation is known to politicians who yet give their votes for slavery extension and perpetuation. The frustration of knowing that there are people who know, but they say nothing. The moral effect of this constant insincerity, the moral effect of witnessing and becoming accustomed to the most appalling forms of crime and oppression, is to me the most awful and distressing part of the subject. And this is something that we identified with as filmmakers when she said, I myself am blunted by use, by seeing, touching, handling the details, in dealing even with the ransom of slaves and learning market prices for men, women, and children. I feel that I acquire a horrible familiarity with evil. The burden borne by those who take up an issue like this and delve into the details and attempt to even understand it, even to know what is happening, when so few people are doing that, increases the weight. Harriet Beecher Stowe was from a religious family. Her father was a minister, and he must have been a quite enlightened man for his day because he did not educate his female children differently from his male children. He held a very high standard. And she had a talent for writing and for argument, and he pushed her and cultivated her abilities so that by the age of 12, she was writing at an adult level and really impressing people. And so she heard about the slavery issue growing up. In her father's sermons, she had brothers, they all became ministers. It was like all ministers all the time type of situation. And this was the environment she was immersed in. And what was happening during this very formative time for her was the struggle in the country about whether we're going to have a majority of slave states or a majority of free states. And California wanted to come into the Union as a free state, and it was almost to the point of open conflict over this, and then a compromise was reached where a terrible deal was struck in order to accomplish a political aim. And the terrible deal was that, okay, the southern states will allow California to come in as free, but the northern states are going to go along with something called the Fugitive Slave Law. And this law allowed slaveholders to go into northern states and pursue and retrieve anyone who had ever been a slave. So Harriet Beecher's sister was in Boston writing accounts to her about these stories. And one of the ones that I remember is there was a man who had escaped slavery. He set up a business reselling earthenware, and he was surviving. And this law was passed, and he became so frightened about what was going to happen, and so he was so afraid of using public transportation or doing anything where he could be apprehended, is that in the wintertime he attempted to go to Canada on foot. And he basically got frostbite and lost both of his feet, fleeing. And these were the kind of stories that were coming in. And her sister knew that Harriet Beecher Stowe was a talented writer. And she wrote this famous letter to her, and she said, I can't really do anything. I don't know what to do, but I know someone who can. And she basically said, why don't you write something and turn this whole country upside down? Oh, and the story is that Harriet read this letter and that she crumpled it in her hand and she just said, if I live, I will do it. You know, and she was in church one day and the final scene of the book came to her, which is the death of this man named Uncle Tom. It came to her all at once. She said it was like a great wind blew into her. And she could all but hold back her tears. And she left the church, went home, and wrote down this scene, read it to her family, and her entire family broke down. And her children, who were 8 or 10, just were just so upset about the nature of slavery, and they could picture it and understand it in a way they didn't before. She understood that it would be easy to write a book that took the worst things that happened and the most sadistic people and made people very angry. But that wouldn't actually transform the situation. Because if people got the idea that it was the poor practice of slavery that was the problem, or bad people being allowed to be slaveholders, that would be disastrous. What she needed people to understand, it was the institution. Once this relationship is set up with another group, and one group is allowed to have absolute power over another, even the best of people, she understood this, even the best of people are going to be a part of terrible atrocities. There were slaveholders in it. I'll give you an example of one of them, a man named St. Clair, and he's portrayed as what we would consider today a progressive person. He was born into a slaveholding family, but he was compassionate, he was thoughtful, he was a critical thinker. When people challenged him about what he was doing, he examined what he was doing, and he acknowledged that it was wrong, and he was very forward-thinking. And he eventually came to the conclusion, due to the arguments of his 8-year-old daughter, that he had a moral obligation to free these people that had the misfortune of being property, and he prepared the paperwork to have this done. And then very shortly before he was going to free them, he was passing by some street brawl, and he's killed by someone with a knife. And because of this random act of violence, all these people who were on the verge of being freed went right to auction with all the rest of his property. And the brilliance of this as a storytelling technique to show, here you have someone who's really trying to do right, but the system is so wrong, the relationship is so wrong, you can't overcome it. So the character of Uncle Tom is very interesting. It's like a thought experiment. What if an utterly peaceful person is caught up in this system, a very spiritual person? What happens to him? Because that's what needs to be understood, is that everybody's going to be harmed. Another thing she did that I think is amazing for the time is she had characters who were African-American slaves who had advanced achievements in different areas. There was a man in the book who was the brains behind this very successful manufacturing business. He was a brilliant inventor, and his owner was becoming very rich off the creations of this man who was a slave. And at some point, word in the community got out that the inventions were being created by the slave. And the man became so angry about this that what he did is he took him out of the factory and his inventing work and basically put him in a field, pulling a plow. And the idea was that the arrogance was even greater than the man's self-interest. But it was also sending a message to the whole country that was new for a lot of people, that African slaves have the same capabilities, the same mental ability, the same range of personalities that all of us have. She showed that. And because it was in the form of a story, people who weren't theologians and philosophers and highly trained, intellectualized people could delve into this subject and talk about it intelligently. So after this book came out, people are now arguing about the characters and different kinds of situations and different points of view on the issue with an intelligence and an understanding that had never happened before. She talked about what the book did. And the people that were the most upset about slavery, other than slaves, who are of course the most upset of all, people who were enslaved, she identified that it made them feel less bitter, I think because they felt like they had a tool. They had a way of basically handing this to people and saying, this is what I see, that they never had before. A phenomenal change for them. And then that helped many people listen to their arguments and come over to be against this institution of slavery. And then it also gave some strength to people who had escaped slavery, and probably people who are still enslaved, probably heard of the book, and it gave them a little ray of hope. You know, the thing about Harriet Beecher Stowe is that she was not only a great artist, she was an activist. And some of the things she did, all of us would understand. For example, when her book first came out, the first copy sold, 59 cents, was bought by her. And she sent it to a nobleman in England that was known to be against slavery. And she sent hundreds of copies around the world to people that she thought were against slavery. And you know, as we know, you know, an informed electorate is a requirement for democracy. Lots of people need to understand to overcome a problem like this. They need to understand why. They need to understand what's happening. And they need to understand, most importantly of all, who it's happening to. And so this connects in to part of how her work inspired our work. When we started out, I think we thought we understood quite a bit about who animals are. And boy, did we have a lot to learn. And throughout the project, we had experiences that transformed our awareness of our own prejudices about animals. And we realized how deeply rooted they were and how pervasive they were. And there's 3 stories that I wanted to share on that. The first one happened when we were filming our first interview with Harold Brown. We, through pure happenstance, connected with him at an event, and we went out in a field, and he started to share this remarkable life experience with us. And we're deeply immersed. And in the midst of it, I felt this hot, heavy breath in my right ear. It was powerful. And then this, you know, it was like this big weight, you know, came down. And I looked up, and an enormous cow is looming over me and just nuzzling my shoulder. And it was like feeling the touch of Mother Earth. It was so personal. And then I turned around, and I saw the most remarkable sight. Arrayed behind us were about 12 cows in a semicircle. And they were standing, watching what was happening. And it was, in a way, our first experience of really seeing with our own eyes, these individuals have community, and their emotional engagement with what was happening was so obvious. And in the film, you can see this. Juanita, who was the closest to Harold, was sighing really deeply when he would talk about something that was very powerful for him emotionally. And it all started to make sense that these animals live communally. They live as a herd. What happens to one affects the other. They're connected. And we were close enough physically to feel that. Just like people in a theater sitting together feel each other's emotions, we felt that. And for me, it was revelatory. I realized how stereotypical and limited my understanding of these animals was. Much later on in the film, we were at Maple Farm Sanctuary, and we were filming a little sequence of a mother hen and her chick. And Sherry, who was one of the founders of the sanctuary, was telling us how the mother hen would demonstrate behaviors and the little chick would imitate. And you know, never in my life had I thought of parenting amongst chickens. It's just not anything I ever thought to think of. And then she started to talk about the feeding behavior. And she started to say, well, you know, when there's really choice food around, the mother hen will pick up the food, bring it over to the little chick, and give it to the chick. She doesn't eat it herself. And she brought in some canned corn, which they go crazy for. She put that down, and we watched this happen. So if chickens raise their young, like so many other animals, and they have that bond and they have that relationship, what does this mean about what happens to them? What does it mean about their capacities? What does it mean about the ethics? And I think what I'm talking about here is the shift from all of this being an abstraction, very abstract question of there being something wrong with our relationship to animals, to starting to really get more insight into who they are. And then through that insight, realizing that what's happening to them, why it's so bad. The last animal experience I wanted to mention is more personal, and it had to do with the passing of our dearly beloved dog, Emma. And Emma was in our lives for many, many years, and she got cancer, and she had one of those journeys out of this earth that was extended and extremely difficult and medically complicated and just very, very painful. And Emma was a very quiet dog and had a very gentle spirit. And we were very close to her, and we got more and more involved in her care. And there was something, I'm going to shed a tear probably talking about this. There was something that happened during the last month of her life where the fact that she was a dog fell away. And maybe for the first time in my life, I saw the individual more than the species. And what I saw was a very dignified individual who struggled for life and who didn't, you know, there was this quality she'd always had when she was with us, which is she'd never wanted to be forced into anything. Didn't want to be forced into the car, and then when she was in the car, she didn't want to be forced out, and was very, you know, strong-willed, and, you know, just didn't like to be pushed around. And that was how she related to death. It was, she did not go gently. She was fighting for every day, and we assisted her in that fight. And during the process, something inside of me and inside of Jenny really changed, and a new way of seeing animals started to happen. And I think we began to get a glimmer into what kind of a relationship and what kind of an understanding some of the people do who are really gifted and who care for many animals, such as Jason and Casey, who are also in the film. And they helped us put to words and to conscious understanding what we had experienced intuitively. And one of the things we learned from them is that when they talked about animals, they used the word individual. And they had this incredible achievement of being able to look at an individual and say, who is this before me? And the most important aspect of that wasn't the package that they were in, the species, even the physical situation. It's who. What does this individual want? What is this individual afraid of? What does this individual need? And they developed a dedication to treating everyone as an individual. This project was a true collaboration. All of us came together with a common purpose to try to create something that could awaken greater compassion, greater understanding of this justice issue, and empower people to get involved and do something about it and change their lives. We see the subjects of the film as being our collaborators because each of them came to very powerful truths in their lives and unique creative solutions to what appear to be insolvable human problems. How many times do we in our lives face up to something that we're doing that we discover is an injustice and not only stop doing it, but also figure out a way to undo some of the damage that we've done and take our hard lesson and share it? It's a very rare achievement. The people in the film did this and shared it with great courage. And the film is what it is because they gave that gift to us and the film's audience. And because of all we learned from a remarkable artist and social justice activist named Harriet Beecher Stowe.